that introduction. I'm not sure if I necessarily agree with that, but nonetheless, thank you very much.
That's okay, I do.
Before we begin today, I know there are a lot of people with different backgrounds, and we've had people come from the other session into this session. So I'd like to kind of get a sense of what people's backgrounds are and what they're interested in getting from this session, just because we had anticipated a different audience and we have a different audience, and I want to make sure we're able to meet everyone's needs as much as possible. So if we can start from you. So if you can say who you are and then what you're interested in learning about today.
I'm Riham Gassas, I'm an international student from Saudi Arabia.
Can you speak louder?
My name is Riham Gassas, I'm an international student from Saudi Arabia. And currently I'm in my second year of the PhD program in couple of family therapy. And my interest is training and program evaluation and development for family therapists. And I'm interested in learning about what do training in family therapy needs to know.
I'm Kiran Gupta. I'm a licensed clinical social worker in private practice. Don't really work with kids or adolescents anymore, mostly adults. And I don't know that much about the Muslim population, so I'm here to learn whatever you can share.
My name is Madiha Haroon. I'm a licensed counselor in Chicago. And one of my clients that I do work with is adolescents, and I do work with a lot of Muslim adolescents as well. So whatever you have to share.
I'm Ikrama Devi. I'm a clinician as well, and I don't work with children so far or adolescents, but I was more interested in learning in terms of how can we as a community connect and assist the Muslim community better in terms of mental health, and how can we kind of reduce the stigma that's associated with mental illness.
My name's Joyce Sebian, and I work with one of the federal agencies, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And my area is more on children's mental health and behavioral health and promotion and prevention side of things, although I'm here for SAMHSA's faith-based initiative, and so we'll try to listen, learn, and share, have a personal connection also.
My name is Elena Molchanova. I'm from Kyrgyz Republic, and I'm here as a visiting. I'm here as a visiting researcher of consortium of multicultural research. Actually, this is just a happy accident for me to be in here. I'm from a Muslim country, and it's just a chance to learn. I'm a psychiatrist, by the way, and clinical psychologist, and I'm working with everybody.
I am a second-year resident at MSU Psychiatry, and I've just started beginning to attend all these conferences and getting to, because this wasn't my field at all. I'm from a totally different background, and I do have a son who's that old, and so it could be something personal to going on.
I'm Denise Smith from here on campus in the Office for Inclusion. I'm a consultant for multicultural issues. And as I design workshops for the staff on campus, I want to make sure that I am being inclusive. So the more I understand about the culture, the religion, the background, the more I can include in my workshops and help the campus truly be inclusive.
I'm Urias Beverly. I teach seminary in Detroit. My background is in pastoral care and counseling, and I'm a therapist and a chaplain. And my most recent thing is having developed a Muslim chaplaincy program. So I'm trying to learn all I can about.
At the seminary you're at?
Yes, at seminary. Trying to learn all I can about how to do that. Furthermore, I have 5 daughters and 1 son and 11 grandchildren. So I'm interested in young people.
I'm Cindy Arkin from Wayne State. I'm one of your colleagues, and I want to hear what you say.
Thank you.
I'm Aisitu from Masjid As-Salam in Detroit.
I'm here because I want to learn more about children's habits.
Sulaiman, Imam of Canteen and Director of Muslim Family Services. I hope to walk away with a health knowledge about our youth.
My name is Ishaq Muhammad, and I'm Imam in the Masjid Salam in Detroit. And then we came today to look at this program, how we can help our young in our society. Thank you so much.
Halim Naeem, limited licensed psychologist, and did a lot of things with Muslim youth over the years, and colleague of Sameera, so coming to increase my knowledge from the research perspective.
I'm Anas Coburn. I'm trained as a marriage and family therapist. I run a program dealing with domestic violence in the Muslim community, and I'm particularly interested in in learning more about what youth know to help them make good decisions before they get married.
I'm Ahmed Kandawi. I'm a clinical social worker. I currently work primarily with survivors of crime, primarily survivors of domestic violence. And I used to work at the counseling and psychological services at U of M. So I would see students and young people. And then I've also done a lot of youth work as a younger person in the Muslim community. And Sameera is a close friend and colleague, so I would also like to see what she has to say today.
I'm Gail Rico, and I'm the academic dean of the College of Osteopathic Medicine here in East Lansing, and here and kind of acknowledging support of the college and the department for your journal and the support of the meeting. And I have no direct connection to the areas of mental health, but I'm here to learn.
Wahida Jabir, I'm a licensed social worker.
Speak louder.
Wahida Jabir, I'm a licensed social worker from Cleveland, Ohio. And I offer a workshop to social workers on how to work with Muslim families. And one of the questions that keep coming up, and these are because they're putting Muslim children in foster homes. And so the questions that keep coming up is about mental health and counseling and self-esteem. And that's not my class. They expect me to answer it. So I just needed some new resources, because actually I'm a retired social worker, so I've been really out of the social work piece for a while, so I'm just trying to bring in new information to my classes. So.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Abdul Rashid Mohammed. I'm recently retired chaplain, also a licensed clinical social worker here in Michigan. And I'm interested, I haven't worked with adolescents in a while, but I am interested in knowing how we can help our youth, our Muslim youth, to navigate some of the negative stereotypes about Muslims in the society, and empower them to continue to practice Islam without understanding all of the negativity that's out there.
My name is Gwendolyn Taylor. I'm the Executive Director for the Michigan Victim Alliance, as well as I'm a therapist at Meridian Psychological. And one of the things that we are encountering is an increase in the number of Muslim youth, especially adolescents, who have gotten caught up into substance abuse and alcoholism. And their parents are bringing them in. We have an intensive outpatient program for alcohol and substance abuse that we run at the clinic, but the parents are totally just at a loss of what to do about this. And so I'm here just to kind of hear what you have to say and talk to others. So thank you.
I'm Zakia Ali from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm a retired counselor, educational counselor. I'm working with Siraj Wahaj's MANA program out of Detroit, and we're doing counseling, marriage counseling, and so on. We have a lot of youth who gravitate toward us just to talk. and I think this would be very helpful for us. I also raised two young men, can't say boys anymore, from infants. They were born Muslim, they remain Muslim, and they have Muslim wives and children. So I'm a mother, a grandmother, and a great-grandmother. Alhamdulillah.
So there are a lot of people come from different backgrounds. So what I'm going to try doing, I'm going to try to get to what everyone's asking for. I don't know if I can accomplish it, but please feel free to ask questions, give input, and engage in discussion. So what I'd like to do, because we're all coming from different backgrounds, is to give people a general framework of how to approach these issues from wherever background or wherever you're going to apply it in your context. And what we do know is that all of us at some point will be interacting with young people, and many young people encounter numerous stressors in their lives. And if we're able to get in touch with young people, identify the signs and symptoms or risk factors that are going on, we can then at least engage with them and help prevent problems down the line. And one of the things that I want to try to do is talk a little bit, first kind of give an introduction of terms that we've been using throughout the day, and then talk about development, risk, and implications based on the area where you're working in. Now, one of the benefits of the afternoon session is I have a good 3 hours, but the other downside is I don't know how many of you guys are comatose after the wonderful food that we had today. So hopefully there's questions, discussions, and if you need a little bit extra, there's some cookies outside and pop, so please feel free and use whatever you need to use to keep yourself awake. So what I'd like to start off with is, I know a number of previous presenters talked about risk, and just kind of a basic definition, depending on, because everyone has different definitions, to talk a little bit about what is risk. Today I'm going to be referring to risk as increased likelihood of negative outcomes in health, or well-being, or social performance, or academic performance. So any negative social outcome among young people. So some of this might be, for example, if you have issues with your health, if you have issues with family cohesion, if there's any of those types of issues, they may impact a young person. And for us to be able to identify, if this is a risk factor, what can I do individually, as a community, as the area of work that I specialize in? What are the areas that we can put into place? And if for those of you who attended the session earlier, I think Dr. Collins had given, Dr. Collins, Jan Collins, on the suicide wall. And if you notice that wall, what it had was a number of different kind of safety valves, that if you take one of those books out, it destabilizes the individual. And that's kind of a helpful way of looking at it in terms of not necessarily destabilize, but it makes it weaker. And so what we want to try to do is identify all those factors that may play a role in the individual and try to catch them as early as possible. So, and then those factors, or those variables, are often referred to as risk factors. And what are those factors that might lead an individual towards engaging in risky behavior? And then it's important for us to really realize, particularly with Muslim youth, that as well as all young people, all individuals, that those factors are going to vary by development and context. And by development, what is a risk factor? If a toddler comes and throws a tantrum, you expect that child to throw a tantrum because they're learning to, learning how to communicate their messages. They're learning how to calm themselves down, cope with their difficulties. But if a college student or an adult has a similar tantrum, we know there's a problem there. And so you can identify that and work for that. So that's what I mean by vary by development. And then vary by context. It's important for us to understand as well that particularly with Muslim youth, they're dealing with numerous contexts. They're dealing with their ethnic and possibly racial, as well as religious, as well as their peer context, as well as the general societal context. So what may be normative in one culture or one context may not be normative in the other context. And then how do you understand and help that individual deal with the normative and non-normative behavior, whatever is normative is considered. And so that's something that oftentimes we forget about, the varying context a young person is in and what will matter at what point and how their contextual norms are, depending on what they identify with most, may or may not be similar to the context of individuals that are important to them in their environment. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, but I just wanted you to kind of think about how context also matters. So I wanted to talk a little bit about development, because I think that's a critical piece that we need to understand regardless of what background we're coming in with. And so with human development, we oftentimes have a very step-by-step process understanding of first this happens and this happens, and it's very stage dependent oftentimes. But if you really understand human experience, what we'll find is that it is a process that's bidirectional. I have an impact on you, you have an impact on me, and in that process we change. But each one of us also are impacted by other aspects. Some of those aspects could be environmental, as well as some things can be internal. And so how this all plays out is different for each person. And so you can't take a cookie cutter approach and how we deal with an individual, because each person is impacted by so many different factors. And so before I show this slide, I will explain it, so please do not freak out. It is somewhat complicated. And I will walk you through it. Don't worry. Okay, so this is developmental contextual perspective, which is proposed by Richard Lerner from Tufts University. And so what their group is saying is that oftentimes when we think of development, we're thinking about this child and really focusing on the behaviors that we see. And that's where we begin our intervention. When in reality, we have to realize that this individual, has numerous internal changes going on, physical and spiritual, and we'll talk about all those in a little bit. But changes in biology, cognition, he or she has a certain personality that you can see from infancy. They have certain temperament, behaviors, they have particular values, health, they may have health issues, developmental level. You have to consider all these factors. You want to start an understanding with that individual. But that child, adolescent, or emerging adult is not living in a vacuum. They may be living with a parent or a caregiver, and so you want to understand what's going on with that parent, what's going on with their health, their developmental level, what are the personality issues, what's all going on with that parent and their values, and how in tune are they, or how out of tune they are there, and where is the overlap, right? So you not only have the parent, but the parent is also impacted by their work situation too. Are they employed or are they unemployed? What's the work stress situation? And all these factors. And that has an indirect impact on the young person, the child, and a direct impact on the parent. So if the parent is working 2 jobs and is not able to engage in the appropriate monitoring for the child, that has an impact on the child. And so we need to consider that in our work. In addition, if the parents are married, what are the issues for them? If there's stress in the family, it's going to directly impact the child, it's going to impact the parent, it's going to impact the parent's ability to parent. And then the social network of the parents as well as the child, that impacts the child as well. And I know a lot of this makes intuitive sense for us, and we see it in our environment, but to really consider all these factors, and then with the school, the teachers, how is the relationship between the student and their teachers, the staff and the teachers, their peers, what is a welcoming, what's the environment like for the child? Does that person feel welcomed or not? And so those are all issues. But that's just one level. So these are multiple interacting factors. And then in addition to that, you have, this is a community, but what if they're part of multiple communities? For example, African American youth. They identify racially with the Black community, religiously with the Muslim community. They may also identify with the neighborhood community, with the greater society. So there's multiple factors. Or if you take someone who's Somali or West African, right? Not only do they have all that, but they also have you may have refugee identification with the refugee community. And the realization that although they may see themselves as Somali or West African, others may see themselves as Black. And so the society treats them that way. So all of these factors impact what's going on for this child. And then in addition to the community, the neighborhood community, the religious community, all those different communities, you have the general society and the general culture. So when we approach young person, instead of looking at maybe this behavior, we need to start thinking about all of this and realize what you're looking at is one snapshot in time. So you may be looking at somebody at age 17, but you want to ask, what happened beforehand? What happened at age 6? What happened at age 2? What happened at age 9? All of those aspects impact the individual you see today. So, do people feel like I've explained this? It's not too overwhelming? Okay. So when we talk about development, we need to understand all those different components that may be in place. So I want to divide everybody, because we wanted to make it a little interactive, into different groups. So we have some clinicians, some community activists, and some chaplains, correct? Did I miss anyone? So if I could ask the chaplains to go in that corner, in that back table, and then the community activists to come at the table over there, and the clinicians to come here. If we could all get up and move. So chaplains are back there, community activists are here, and clinicians come here. Multiple identities. Choose the identity you would like to be a part of.
Yeah, you have multiple. And I'm in of all three.
Okay. I want everyone to look at this case and look at it from a similar. I left a lot of details out so that you can make things up. But I want you to look at this case and think about how would you, in your sphere of influence, address this issue. Specifically, identify what additional information you would want to know before doing anything, and how would you obtain this information? Okay, and I'll present this before. So the case study is about Ali. Ali is a 13-year-old boy exhibiting behavior problems at home and school. His aunt reports that he has become increasingly moody, disruptive, and oppositional over the past 2 months. He also bullies his 7-year-old brother. Additionally, Ali's teacher complains that he is inattentive and is not performing well in school. So clinicians, assume this is a referral to you as a clinician. Community activists, consider this as a referral. As a parent is kind of complaining to you, what am I going to do with this child? And for those who are in the chaplaincy, what would you do if this was kind of referred to you? Okay. And again, what is the additional information you would want to know, and how would you get it? Okay. And I'll show you the model to make it easier. Based on this model, We'll spend 10 minutes kind of trying to ask what are the questions you'd want to ask. Because again, the goal of this program is I feel it's extremely important that you ask the questions. We oftentimes jump to finding an answer to a solution. But really, the questions you ask dictate the direction you go. So spend about 10 minutes as a group making a list of what are the questions you'd want to know more about, and how would you go about getting that information? Accurate information. Okay, can I get everyone's attention again? So if we could have somebody from the back table tell us what would you do, what were the types of questions you'd want to know more about, and then how would you get that information from the area of work that you're working in?
Well, we had a diversity of, some diversity of opinion as to how we would go about doing an assessment, but I think the kind of conclusion or consensus was that this information here is only part and parcel of the issue, that there's a lot of other information that is the problem or perhaps part of the problem that is not being presented. And so, you know, where we started, we had some kind of diversity of opinion about that, but we did come to a consensus, I believe, that we needed to get more information before we could go further.
And what type of information did you want to know more about?
Well, for example, I said that we would need to know something about the parents and their relationship. Because he's a 13-year-old, he has a great deal of dependency still as an adolescent on adults. And it could be that, you know, he lives in a very dysfunctional environment. You know, the parents themselves may not get along very well, or there could be some domestic violence going on there. There could be some substance abuse going on. I mean, it could be a number of different things that we just don't know. Those type of behaviors is kind of normally indicative that there's some other things going on in the home, either in his immediate family or his extended family. Because sometimes the Alis of the world don't just live as we do here in Western culture, conventionally with a mom and a dad, but sometimes there could be uncles and grandparents and others who also have an impact on behavior. So, you know, we would need to know more about the family itself before we could go further. And there may be some other things that the group may want to chime in with that, but that's kind of the way I saw it.
Well, I think one of the significant things that you said, we don't know anything about Ali exactly with his name. We can make some assumptions, we can guess. He could be, and you know, with his name, we should make sure we don't go too broadly making assumptions.
I didn't get a chance to chime in much in the group, but I felt that if we have access to the boy, which just doesn't really tell us if we do or not, but if we do have access to the boy, I think there's a wealth of information that we can get from him. And we can also get his feelings on what's going on. Rather than just facts, we can get his point of view. And I think that without that, we really can't go forward. Even if we talk to everyone in the family and everyone at the school, we still have to hone in on how he sees things. So I think that there's a great deal of information that we can get from him.
So some of the things you guys really pointed out was really important for us to really think about. We don't know much about this child, and purposely wanted you to not give you much information so that you start asking the questions. Because oftentimes we're given a case and we don't have the information, and we have this tendency to fix automatically. And sometimes we do a lot more damage than help when we don't ask all the questions. And so I want to encourage you to always ask questions. Another point you just brought up was the fact that you want to get multiple perspectives on different situations. And in that process, you may get a different sense of what's going on. which is critical in terms of moving forward. And then for your group?
So we focused on what we would talk with Ali about. We acknowledged that we would also want to talk to family members and to the school, but we focused on him. And so we wanted to ask him about his friends, and we wanted to ask him about essentially his identity, his ethnicity or his cultural background, or how he sees himself, and his relationship with his family. And we want to know, what does he like to do? And what does he think he's good at? To get more of a sense of, that can pull us in a direction to find out whether he feels like he's being suppressed, or he feels like he's got things that are positive going on for him. And then finally we put down, just talk to him about school. What's going on at school? There's lots of different things that his relationships at school may be a lot of what's going on here.
And one of the things you just pointed out is also finding out not only about the problem behaviors, but also what's going well for him. What is he proud of himself about? What is there for him to kind of yearn towards, to help him build, if there are issues of self-esteem, or if there's just knowing that you don't see him as his problem child, but there's a bigger picture to who he is. And that's really key when you're working with young people. Thank you. You guys,
okay.
Miscellaneous group.
Yeah. Okay, basically a lot of what everybody else said, we said, because we don't know a lot about Ali. But we would have to talk to his teacher, his aunt, his brother. Why is it his aunt that's reporting? Where's his family at? How extended is his family? If in fact Ali is Muslim and he's 13, he might be reaching puberty and, oh my God, now I got to really pray. Something as simple as that might be, on his mind, that he's going into the adult world and now he's going to be treated differently. So, and find out where he's at, and what else? What's that?
Yeah, we also talked about the teachers and certain biases that come up from the teachers. It's not always the child. We immediately jump to the conclusion that it's the child. Teachers who are not well informed and don't understand, we were going from the premise that perhaps he is Muslim and his attire may be different, or his parents' attire may be different, and there's stereotypes that teachers hold and biases that they hold that may be having an impact on his behavior.
We also had you might be in love.
Yes, yes. He is at that age.
But I think one of the things you pointed out that I think the other groups might have missed was, why is the aunt bringing him in? And that's a good question. I mean, it's a question you want to know about, as to what, it tells you a little bit about what family dynamics may be going on, or not going on, or, what is normative, what's not normative. And so, great.
All right, so it's clinicians here, so we got clinical, so we basically said to do a complete biopsychosocial.
That's why you guys are last.
Scare him.
So here we go. All right, so the first question we asked was, where are the parents? What happened 2 months ago? What was his behavior like 2 months ago? What's his cultural background? What's his immigration status? Why is the aunt bringing him there? What have the, okay, I'm trying to get the next one. Ask the parent or not. Ethnicity, asking about the ethnicity, background was important. Asking about his relationships, his physical and mental health. Ask about his school and community, what socioeconomic status was in the school. Some of the behavior could be acting out as a coping mechanism. So he's maybe hanging around a crowd or what have you, and it might be that's just how you got to get around at school. So what's the school like? Also ask his younger brother. involved, you know, we wanted to see if he was involved in, with substance abuse, you know, his socioeconomic status. And then his religiosity, his own, you know, and we touched on this a little before, how is he coming into terms with his own religion? And then his support system. There were some other questions I couldn't quite read, but his support system. So who does he actually lean on to give a support system? So some of these things are pretty important in terms of, again, connecting with the feelings. How does he draw? What does he draw towards people? He tried to take the board, the Wheel of Fortune, sort of thing, the board into, you know, the context at the different levels, you know, because a lot of these things can have different meanings. And I think one of the important things, what Sister Zakiya said much earlier, was what does all this mean to him? What is, you know, what is he acting out? Is it acting out? Things like that. So that's what we came up with. What we had.
Great. So the point of this exercise, ask the questions. Ask, and realize that there may be many different factors going on for this individual. So I want to move a little bit more towards development. When we talk about development, many of you may have taken numerous classes, courses, studied the different theories of development, different Piaget stages, Vygotsky, all the different stages. And that information I'm not going to cover because it's online. You can get basic information on the biological stages, psychological stages, social, spiritual. It's all there. But one of the things that when you're dealing with a young person, you want to ask yourself, where is he or she is supposed to be, at least in a context. It may be that you may be using a context that may or may not fit for this individual, but where would you expect them to be, and what would it look like, and what is considered normative in his environment, and what is considered non-normative in his or her environment. And one is a non-normative, not engaging in risky behavior. So it could be that a young woman may decide to not wear the hijab, and she's in an environment where nobody wears hijab. And so it may not be an issue for her. But if that same young woman, is in an environment where everybody's wearing hijab, how does she experience that? How does she experience it? Is she okay with it, or is she not okay with it? Those are questions you want to see the person within that context. Or for an individual, for example, I mentioned earlier in terms of alcohol abuse, right? So in a college environment on campus, it may be something that a lot of people do on campus in the dorms. But if their religious beliefs, and there may be the religious beliefs that may prohibit alcohol use, but they may not have an issue with it internally. But their parents may have an issue with it. So how does one reconcile all these different factors? You want to know what would it look like and how risky is that behavior. And so understanding the cultural norms of the majority culture, the cultural norms of that individual's race, ethnicities, and the different groups that they identify with. And what are the community norms for that individual? And what really matters? It could be the community norms, maybe norms that they could care less about. And so that's important for you to keep in mind and not assume that this behavior may be risky behavior when it may not be risky behavior for that individual. So with adolescents, one of the interesting things is the fact that there's so many different changes going on. If you remember the chart I showed you, that's part of development that's ongoing for individuals, regardless if you're younger or older. But during adolescence, there's also more complications because there's so many different changes going on. You've got the biological changes in terms of physical development, sexual maturation. How does a young person deal with all those changes? Do they struggle? For example, I'll talk about the risk factors in a second, so I'll hold my thoughts. But so So psychologically, numerous cognitive changes going on in terms of the brain development, their ability to think in abstract terms, they be able to think about purpose, have introspect, look at themselves and how they see, what do they think their values and beliefs are, and they're able to think about it more and more higher thinking. And then there's spiritual exploration that often occurs during this time period. And then social changes in terms of the shifts in reference groups. It might have been initially their parents had a greater influence, but with shifting reference group, they may give more attention to their peers and what they say, what matters. And so those changes are also going on. Now, some of the risk factors, this is obviously not an exhaustive list, but some of the factors that we might find under biological would be health problems. Does the individual have, say, diabetes, and how does that impact them and how they interact with their peers? Does that inhibit them from engaging in certain activities? How does that impact the individual? Neuropsychological deficits, difficulties with attention and behavioral control. So if a young person is hyperactive or impulsive, and then makes rash decisions, then those decisions then have an impact on how people around them perceive him or her. So those factors also could be potential risk factors you might want to think about when you're dealing with an individual. Psychological, such as cognitive, low intellectual functioning, self-esteem, poor coping skills. I had a case one time where an individual had low IQ, and in the process of that, somebody used them for picking up some drugs for them, and then that individual got caught. But it had to do with the person's low IQ. She got in trouble, not realizing what had happened and what she was actually doing. And so low IQ could be a risk factor to getting someone engaged in risky behavior without even realizing it sometimes. Poor coping skills. Sometimes when an individual, a young person is not able to cope with the stress around them, young people may engage in cutting. We have a lot of cutting going on amongst some of our Muslim youth, some girls. And one of the challenges is if they are covered, and their hands are covered, you can't see if they've been cutting. And so unless their parents are looking and so they tell someone, then that's one of the only ways you'd find out. So cutting is becoming increasingly an issue. Self-esteem, we're having a lot of issues with eating disorders. And people may have are increasingly having either real or perceived trauma. So you may have, for example, and we'll talk about this later on about Islamophobia and the stress that's impacting young people. But if a young person may, even if it's not a real threat, even if it's perceived threat, that has an impact on the individual psychology. And so being aware of those risk factors as a clinician, as an activist, as a healthcare provider, all of that is really important in terms of making sure you have the community support systems in place. Spiritual or moral risk factors that may be in place. If the individual doesn't necessarily connect or believe in what they've been taught. So many young people may have been taught Islam in a particular fashion, but they are not able to connect with that because it's not relevant for them. So that becomes a risk factor because they may totally shut it out and may not want to use that as a moral compass. So those are things that we need to be aware of. And then antisocial beliefs and values that they may have adopted either from themselves or their experiences, their peers, or what they see around them.
Oftentimes in adolescence, there's kind of this awakening of the moral consciousness, and one of the things that happens is that you may have identified with the Muslim community, and you may have kind of an ideology about how great Islam is, but as your moral compass awakens, you realize, some of these guys around here aren't so great. Mm-hmm. And so you kind of throw out all of it, and now you really are at sea. Because they're not really, you suddenly realize, wait, these people aren't living up to what they're professing, so then they're just lost.
And what you're finding is, I have no data to to support what I'm saying, but just clinical evidence across the nation, is that in the masajids, where there is a much more rigid interpretation and application of Islam, you see a lot more young people running away from the masjid, and a lot more people who are disinterested in the religion and totally disidentify with it, just totally, and you see a lot more risk-taking behaviors going on there. Whereas in the masajids, where there is more flexibility, more youth engagement, more empowerment, you see more, not all, but more young people coming to the masajids and using that as a base and kind of like a sense where they can get moral direction.
This happened with my son too. He's studying at Indiana University, Bloomington, and he goes on internet and he reads a lot about stuff, and he was totally, I think he has more knowledge of Islam than me, and he was really practicing it. And so he heard a few things in masjid. Somebody was talking something about, about America and stuff, and he totally disliked it and said, I'm not going to go there anymore. I don't have to. They're talking against, I don't know what was that, something political or something. So he said, I'm not.
I think what a lot of people
going there.
Need to.
He is. He's doing prayers and everything. He would do it in, in the university. He would just put on his jacket as a prayer mat, and he would do it. He's that much into it, but he stopped going to masjid.
And I think those are the questions the community really needs to start thinking about. What are we doing, and how is that impacting young people? And are we going towards our goal or away from our goal? Because what happens sometimes is in many aspects of Islam, there are multiple interpretations of, and obviously not the worship aspects, but interpretations of legal aspects of Islam. And in trying to make everyone happy, sometimes we tend to adopt what we may think is the safest approach. And sometimes the safest approach in terms of the legal perspective may be not appropriate for the environment, for the society. And so that's where attention kind of develops amongst young people. They begin to feel that the community is no longer relevant for them. One of the positives, though, of this is young people are now, with the advent of internet, you have multiple sources of information. So in the past, you were stuck to your community. Whereas now, with the internet, you have many different, you may not like the scholars in your area, so you may connect with a different scholar. And there's much more information available online. So that's a positive aspect of internet. But again, a very important point that we need to be aware of.
I was wondering, in your clinical work, have you ever come across explaining to the adolescent the different stages and things that he is going through because of his age? And if so, has that made any difference in them being able to negotiate this part of life better?
Yeah, I think part of it is educating the young person as well as educating the parents and the community. And I'll give you an example of a situation that just happened a few days ago. I was talking to a parent, and the parent was complaining, oh, my child is so lazy, she's so lazy, she doesn't even make lunch for school, and she just comes home, and as soon as she comes home, she just eats so much food, and just totally binges, and is so talkative, she drives me crazy. So I said, okay, that's fine. What's going on at school? And I found from other sources that at school, what happens is during lunchtime, all the kids are getting together and talking. They're talking about what so-and-so did Friday night, who they slept with, the party they went to, and the young person just could not connect with her peers. And so instead of feeling like the odd man out at lunch table, what she decided to do is, instead of feeling isolated, let me at least go to the library, get my homework done, not feel so left out, not feel like I can't connect to people, and let me just stay here, do my homework, and then come home and eat lunch. So that was how she navigated it. But until this was raised with the parent, the parent had framed her as my child is lazy, as opposed to, wow, she's successfully, or she's adapting to her situation in a way that's relevant for her and that's helpful to her. And so that's one of the important things of asking the questions, because had you not asked those questions, had I not asked those questions, the mother would never have known that it wasn't that she was lazy, she was just trying to deal with the issue at hand. So that's an example of where I would use talking to the child as well as the parent and get the community to understand what are the challenges and issues. So, and the other aspect in terms of the community is sometimes our approach is such that the child has to be perfect. You cannot make any mistakes in a sound, right? But in reality, you're going to have your ups and downs, and they're going to make mistakes. But if the young person feels like they've been judged and they've been banished from the community, they're not going to come back. And so that's another challenge that we have within the community. Good points, though. The other risk factors, so we talked a little bit about the factors that may be in place. Another risk factor in terms of social is if the individual lacks social skills or social cues. They may miss important cues and then feel alienated again or isolated again or be totally confused as to why is everybody laughing at me? What's going on? What did I miss? Or if the individual is extremely aggressive, they may be rejected by their peers as well. And so if you're constantly being rejected by your peers, that has an impact on how you see yourself and how you're able to interact with others. And also realize there are gender differences that exist. For example, for young women who sexually mature earlier, they're at higher risk of numerous different problems than a young man who matures earlier than his peers. So similarly, in terms of for many young Muslim women, when they mature, what they're expected to start wearing the hijab. So how do they deal with that? That impacts so many different domains. So again, those were not necessarily risk factors, the fact that you mature and you have to wear hijab, but the issue of how do you address it, how does the community react to it, how do your peers react to it, all of those factors have an impact on the individual. So then we look at, so far we've only talked about this aspect, this part of the Wheel of Fortune thing. Now I want to look over to the next area, which is the immediate context, the parent, the school, etc. So again, in terms of the family context, we would want to know more about family composition, extended family. In the case that we talked earlier, why was it that his aunt was bringing it in? Is it the aunt was trying to do the mom a favor? Are the parents not available? Are they depressed? Are they having issues? Is this family who's going through PTSD due to refugee experience? We don't know any of that stuff. But having the understanding of what is the family composition is important. Who are the different players in the family? It may be that it is a nuclear family, but the grandmother in India has a huge influence on what happens and what is not happening in the family. Those are factors to consider. The parents' health, their personality, values, the quality of their marriage, if they're constantly fighting, if they're exhausted, if they're working 2 different jobs, if there's no support system, emotional support, all of that will have an impact on the child. And so keeping those factors in mind, again, as we go through each one, I'm going to identify some of the risk factors to be aware of when you're dealing with young people. What are the peer norms, values, acceptance? Sometimes peer pressure could be positive. Sometimes it could be negative. There are certain youth groups, Muslim youth groups, which are extremely helpful and positive to young people and really helps them identify and connect with people who may be going through similar challenges and trying to navigate being both Muslim, being American, being whatever ethnic, racial identity, balancing all those and integrating and asking those questions that they need to. But there's some peer influences which ends up being negative, right? So asking those questions, and one of the challenges a lot of Muslim families don't realize is a lot of times they think if my child is friends with other Muslim kids, they'll be okay. what we find is that's not always the case. They're doing drugs and drinking alcohol, and they're doing a lot of different things with their Muslim peers. So you cannot automatically assume that that they're okay. They're not having issues. So one is understanding what are the norms of the individual, their peers, how do their values, the young person's values, similar or different from their peers, their values, how accepted is the individual amongst their peers, how respected are they, who are the different influences and why, what is their educational environment like, in terms of teachers, the relationship with teachers, do they feel connected with their school, do they feel supported? Some schools are extremely supportive, where they have teachers who have trainings on understanding what issues facing Muslims. Even if they don't have those training, they're open to different cultures and values. We have some administrations where there is a good parent-teacher working relationship. So those things you'd want to know. How welcome does a child feel in the school? Or do they feel they're always under threat? They're always under the microscope because they're Muslim. We don't know these things, so you'd want to find out. And also the community setting. What does their neighborhood look like? What does their geographic location look like? Being Muslim in Grand Rapids is a totally different experience than being Muslim on the south side of Dearborn. Totally different experience. And so being aware of those different factors. And then who do they identify with? Are they identifying with the Muslim community? Primarily with their racial or ethnic community? What matters? Who do they even identify with, if they even identify with either of those communities? So again, these are some of the questions you again want to be asking.
I'm thinking of it particularly when you talk about the family. I have a ring-size seat to watch my 3 granddaughters that my daughter has, and there were 2. And the youngest granddaughter the youngest of the 2 used to sit on my lap. And I was God Almighty to her. And then a younger child was born. And I actually saw what I had read about, all these years, moving into the middle child position. And that did a horrendous thing to her. And I keep trying to say to her mother and to her grandmother and to everybody, but nobody seems to get it but me. This has been a real devastating thing for her. Changed her personality, just did all kinds of things to her. And it's so subtle. I mean, it looks like she's a very loving child and sensitive and whatever, so she doesn't make a lot of noise about it. But the older she gets, as she goes into adolescence, some of that has turned into anger, and she acts that anger out in some ways with her sisters, for example.
I mean, sibling position does matter in many cases. And just even being aware of that, how does that impact the situation at hand? Or, even if there's no situation to be concerned about, just keeping an eye on that and kind of thinking forward what could happen and providing the support. So if she is acting out because she's feeling that she has to get attention somehow, how can you put in place opportunities or support system where she feels that I'm getting the attention that I need?
So the positive thing she does is make straight A's. And the thing that I do is when I'm going somewhere, I say, "You want to go with me?" "Oh, yes." So I take her along.
And that's part of putting in the protective factors.
Well, I was going to say in terms of immediate context, one that for me, a very big one in working with adolescents is to ask about their media environment. Because they spend a lot of time plugged in to their ears and onto the internet, and there's a lot of different environments out there within that, and you can learn an awful lot about them. I had one client, one kid who he did nothing in school. He was having a terrible time, and he spent all of in his family, everyone had a personal computer, and they literally did not have enough food. They spent all in the family, but they spent all their time in online environments. And so because I knew a little bit about these games, I asked him, what is his name? online. What is his avatar's name?
Ah.
His avatar's name was Bereft. And that was the beginning of being able to get in and find out what his world was like, because there was no other, only through knowing what his media environment was, that was more important to him and more real to him than his real life.
Which is also now impacting ability to socially connect in life situation. And that's actually an important context that we need to start adding as we think about, you know, what is your media context? What is your social, like, how are you connecting with people? What are you doing? So thank you for sharing that information. So in terms of family risk factors, loss of a parent is extremely, has a huge impact, can potentially have a huge impact on a young person in terms of either death, divorce, family separations. For example, many refugees in the process of trying to come over here, the family might get separated for you know, sometimes long periods of time, especially when it's younger. And so in that case that I mentioned earlier, it was an issue of family separation and eventual reunification, and the parents were so having a lot of issues with depression and anxiety. They weren't able to bring the child in, so that's why they amp brought him in. But I mean, again, thinking about those issues in terms of, is there any of this stuff going on for a young person? And even if the parent is physically present, are they emotionally and psychologically present? Nowadays, with the phones and, you know, getting on the iPhone and all that, a lot of parents are online half the time and not emotionally there for their kids, and that's increasingly becoming problematic for young people. Having unsupportive family environment, lacking family cohesiveness. A lot of times families are not if they don't have family rituals or connection or having negative interactions, a lot of disrespect, that impacts a young person, how they see themselves and how they feel this is what is considered normal interaction. Because what they see in the family, then they also also act out in their environment. And if you're putting down others are going to probably react to you in a negative way as well. Poor monitoring and guidance of children, low level of positive involvement with parents. These are all factors. If parents having mental health problems, that's going to distract the parent. Or family, if there's any type of family violence or aggression, many times within the Muslim community, women will stay in an abusive relationship for the benefit of the kids. And that's something, as community activists, we really need to sit down and think and help the families to figure out what is the best approach. Is it necessarily best for the kids? Is it necessarily good for the individual, the male or the female, regardless of who is the perpetrator? So to really kind of think about what's going on immediately, and then long term, what are the impacts? What are the potential impact for potential individuals? So, as a community, for imams or for community activists, if you know any of this is going on, we need to immediately have support services available for them. And one of the challenges I see a lot of times, for example, in families where single parent houses, there isn't that support. We don't have, because a lot of times we assume within the Muslim community that everyone is a two-parent family, and most of the social support network available is based on that model, when in reality, that isn't the case. And we don't have the necessary support available for families who aren't necessarily two-parent. And even if they are two-parent, the stress is a lot for a lot of people who are working. What are the support services available for young people whose parents are working or maybe overstressed? All of that stuff we need to think about. What family support resources do we have available?
I was just going to say, I know your focus is on the adolescent, but people think also about the early years. That we know so much about infancy and toddlerhood, that many of these same risk and protective factors may play out in adolescence, and we so often think that like an infant or toddler isn't aware of what's going on, but they all are like sponges and taking it all in, so they're
all these behaviors play out.
Kind of piggybacking on what you're saying is a lot of times when we see issues, we're seeing it usually during adolescent and early and emerging adulthood. But a lot of what we see is a result of what's happened in those early years. And that's a time period when parents are physically exhausted, let alone the mental exhaustion that goes along with that. I'm still going through that period, so I can tell you for that for sure. It's extremely exhausting. But then if we don't have programs available, and it could be very simple, you don't need someone who's trained in the mental health field to do a lot of these programs. Having a parent and top program, what that can help is have programs where parents can come together and connect with other people who are in the same developmental stage that they're in, connect, ask ideas, get questions, read articles together. Those types of activities are helpful. Or even having something like a mom's night out, where moms can get away from the kids and have a break. And one of the things we do in our community is we have women's hockey, and Wednesday night, doesn't matter what is happening, we are all there playing hockey, because that's a de-stressor for many of us.
I'm looking at this list and some of the other lists that we've had in front of us today, and they're almost exactly the same as people who, whether you're Muslim or you're not, the list is the same. I would find it helpful to brainstorm, maybe even with the group, some ways that in particular Muslim adolescents may present. Because or even some ways that, for instance, you mentioned the mom's night out, and very subtly you said a sister's night on Wednesday. Well, many people may not realize that some Muslim women will only congregate with other Muslim women. So there are some things that I think may be specific to the Muslim community, culturally and religiously, that we could probably do well to point out as we go along.
That's a good idea, and that's one of the goals. I mean, what I'm presenting in terms of the risk factors right now are general, mainstream, what are the risk factors. The research on Muslim youth, the risk factors, we're at the beginning stages of development. We have some information, and myself and Cynthia and Wahib Abu Ras, who's going to be presenting tomorrow, have done some work on alcohol, tobacco, and water pipe use. But there's just so much work that needs to be done. And we're trying to find out what everyone else is doing, but we're really in the preliminary stages, and so what we're having to do is work off of what's already been done. And in reality, everyone's a human, right? Muslim, Christian, Jewish, we're all human. We have the same issues. We may find different sources and different approaches to dealing with it, but part of our humanity is we share similar issues and problems. And so we have more in common than we have not common. And so it's helpful for us to take these information. But like you said, when you say brainstorm in terms of ideas, do you mean stop right here and say, okay, these are the issues, let's brainstorm, what can we do? Or are you just to mention ideas as we go by?
Let's brainstorm, for instance, how would an unsupportive family environment, how would that present itself in an Muslim adolescent, as opposed to, or even as opposed to more or less, someone who is not Muslim? Are there any things that would stand out that you would see, or that you may see, or that you wouldn't see at all?
So I think the environments you would see similar, but for example, in some of the Muslim families, you will see the Quran, verses from the Quran and the Hadith used in a particular manner for a particular purpose. And so that's what I would see, which we tend to use in a negative fashion as opposed to a positive fashion, when there's so much in the Quran and Sunnah about that is very positive in terms of, you think about positive psychology, a positive approach. The prophetic model, if you look at it, is really very in terms of developing protective factors and having that positive family. It's there, but we tend to focus on negative aspects.
I'm wondering if people who are not Muslim understand what you just said. That's my question.
Good point. So in terms of explaining what I just said?
And all along, yes.
Okay. So just to reiterate my point, oftentimes you have culture and you have religion. And fortunately or unfortunately, for whatever reason, there is a lot of intertwining that happens. And many times it's very hard for Muslims to see the difference, what is cultural values and beliefs and what is religious values and beliefs. And to be honest, part of it has to do with the fact that Islam is not particularly for one culture or another. You have certain principles and beliefs, and it's applied to a particular culture, and then that has different cultural forms. So you have the basics of beliefs across Muslims all over the world, but how someone may dress or cultural activities may be different in Malaysia, which may be different than Europe, than in South America, than America. And so you'll see those variations. And so part of us is to really help the Muslim community in America to help understand what is culture, what is religion, and what could be helpful for the individual at hand, for that person. So in terms of the hockey night that I explained earlier would be acceptable in certain communities and would totally be unacceptable in other communities. And so being aware when you do present ideas, what is culturally and religiously relevant or doable in that community. So I think part of it is, so for those of you who are working in the community context, to understand what would work in your community. And that's kind of the reason why I listed the risks and asked you to start thinking about the questions beforehand, so that when you do go, you can work within that community. Even if you think about it, I'm from Detroit, Metro Detroit area. What would work in one area of Detroit would not work in another area. So that's another thing to consider.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment. Professionally, I think another way of looking at this on the same wavelength is I need to be aware of, from a professional standpoint, how whoever it is that I'm working with is coming across to me, and how there may be some transference from time to time. If I have a 13-year-old adolescent, but I'm dealing with a 13-year-old adolescent from a different culture, I have to be aware of how my own stuff as a parent and dealing with my 13-year-old may get transferred onto this 13-year-old and whatever his or her issues is, and how I deal with my own 13-year-old.
And part of it also goes to what are your assumptions about that person and
Exactly.
how do you deal with that person.
Exactly.
And that's critical because your assumptions can direct how your body language, the questions you ask, how you deal with that individual, and that other individual, the adolescent or emerging adult, may have their own assumptions about you. Well, what do you know about my culture? What do you know about my reality? You don't know anything. And so how do you get past that?
Yeah, and another way of saying it is I need to make sure that I'm not dealing with this person as a parent. I'm not seeing the client as a parent. And sometimes that's easy to happen, whether we realize it or not. Which is obviously what transference is. You're not consciously aware of it, but you're in a professional environment supposedly dealing with the person professionally, but could be coming across with a person like their mom or dad, which could be counterproductive.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things, and I think the public health model is extremely important for us to really consider, because one avenue may work for one person, it may not work for another person. It may be for one particular person, the imam would be the best person to reach that message to him or her. Where another person, it could be a youth mentor. Or another person, you might need the psychologist to get involved, or the social worker. And so having multiple different avenues within the community setting really helps to meet different people's needs at wherever they are, at a level they are. Good points. In terms of the other immediate context, would be looking at the peer environment. What's going on with peer? Individuals who have peers engaging in risky behavior are more likely to engage in risky behavior. If your friends are drinking, it's much easier to drink. You may feel more inclined or you may want to drink with them or use hookah, right? If you are rejected by your peers, this is another area where you may become more socially isolated and alienated. And in that process, you can take different pathways. And those are things to keep aware of in terms of it's not just the quote-unquote haram or the prohibited behaviors people may get involved into, but we also have to be aware of extremist ideas and understandings and approaches. If you're feeling you're getting rejected by everybody, some young people may take the approach, well, if you're going to reject me, I'm going to reject you, and take that attitude and that approach, and that's something to be aware of as well. Do we have those factors in place where people, if they may be rejected in one environment, are there multiple peer environments that they can go to where they can feel accepted? Also, the lack of involvement in conventional activities. A lot of times many times our children don't go to the prom, but is there a social alternative? Do they have something like the example of the young girl I was talking about, a 14-year-old person whose mom thought she was lazy? If she were, instead of saying, oh, I'm not going to the prom, I have another party I have to go to, that helps her deal with her peers in a way that she doesn't feel out of place. So are there alternatives to conventional activities that other peers are engaged in? And then if an individual has poor academic performance, they're at greater risk as well. So again, these are some, not all, there are many more risk factors just to be aware of. And I think for those of you, there are many of you here who are involved in the masajids, the mosques, in the community, to really be aware of what alternatives do you have for young people. I had one person who was my area of research is looking at different aspects of Muslim youth, and so one of the interviews we had done, the young person was complaining, our community thinks that we have activities for the youth. Their version of activities is going roller skating, but we've been doing that since the 80s, and it's time to be updated. And so just helping us realize that what may have been cool when we were young may not be cool anymore. And so we need to help young people get empowered and come up with ideas that are socially relevant for them. There's also educational risk factors that we need to consider as well. If a young person does not bond with their school, does not feel connected, if they don't feel that others expect them to success, if they don't have the resources in their school that allows them to fulfill their potential, that is a major risk factor. And so poor academic performance is a risk factor. Having a disempowering educational culture. Some communities some of the public schools where there are large concentrations of Muslims who may be immigrant, a lot of times young people complain that their teachers automatically put them in ESL classes. And they automatically assume that they're never going to graduate from high school or they're never going to go to college. And so they get funneled into a different track without giving them the opportunity to succeed. That's one thing to consider. Like if that is going on, there needs to be a community as well as increased empowerment in terms of communication between the educators and the students and the parents. Lack of positive reinforcement at school, or lack of feeling of safety and stability in the classroom. You don't know if there's going to be a gun. You don't know if there's going to be a shootout. You don't know what's going on, and if there's a lot of bullying going on. Those are things to consider. Lack of teacher resources. If the teachers don't have the resources they need to do their job, they're going to be stressed. And if they're going to be stressed, they're not going to be able to do what they need to do to help young people. And that also results in low school morale, which impacts everybody, the students, the administration, the teachers. Poor rule enforcement, unsatisfied teachers, poor parent-teacher relationships. I've heard of some districts where the parents don't trust the teachers and the teachers don't trust parents. Some of it is due to cultural barriers, some is due to language barriers, many different factors. But again, all these factors they're present, these are risk factors to consider. And so it's really important for us to really think about what can you do in your capacity.
Something I've noticed with Muslim children in the Muslim community, very often we send our children to public schools, and we're very nervous about that, afraid they're going to lose their religion and so on, or be involved and influenced by people who are not Muslim in a negative way. On the other hand, sometimes, speak louder. On the other hand, sometimes we put our children in Muslim schools, and we take a hands-off attitude. Well, they're in a Muslim school, so everything's going to be fine. When in reality, very often that is not the case. And we can run down, of course, these same things in a Muslim school. But the point I'm trying to make is that even though a child is in a Muslim school, and the parents may assume that everything is all right with that child, we still have to talk to that adolescent to find out for sure, how are things going on for you? Even though mom says it's fine, dad says it's wonderful, what is actually on the ground happening to you?
And that's a major issue a lot of times, like you said, oh, they're probably safe. And you've got drug problems, alcohol problems, you've got problems with bullying going on, you have many different problems. And then the whole administration, teacher, the morale, and all of those issues take place. Now that we're all kind of refreshed and some of us are back. Can we start? Okay. So just to reorient ourselves, we've talked a little about child, parent, school, peers. We'll go on to now to the societal factors we want to, or community factors that we want to consider. Again, there's been a lot of work and that we've known about poverty and how that impacts a community, how it stresses a community, how that has an impact in terms of impacting what resources are available, the time available, the ability to monitor young people. What's also something that we don't know much about, but I think we should consider about, is the other end of the spectrum of wealth. When we have communities which are extremely wealthy, what is the price of privilege? How is that impacting young people? And a lot of the young people that we are seeing are individuals who are struggling with issues of privilege. They have everything, and they can't appreciate anything. And there is that lack of purpose in life and meaning in life. And so that's another consider. I didn't write it up just because we don't have much research on that, but that is something that we're increasingly finding within the Muslim community, where they have attitudes in the sense that we don't have to do it, we don't care, we don't want to listen. All of these issues are coming up, but part of it has to do with that, what is the price of privilege. So again, to consider that when you're working with young people, how do you deal with that? How do you address that issue when someone is coming from a quote unquote privileged community or background? What is it that can help them reach them? Is that something that could potentially be a risk factor?
There was a term that began to be used in the 90s when the economy was roaring and people invested and became millionaires overnight without even expecting it. And the term was called affluenza. It's something that hit them out of nowhere and they didn't understand. Before you knew it, they were into a lot of dynamics they didn't know what to do with.
And that's
Did you want to, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Go on.
I was noticing that in the Muslim community, before 9/11, the Muslims from certain countries, I think it would be more like, let me put it a different way. Muslims who could be identified as white Americans considered themselves privileged often, just as white Americans did. And after 9/11, there was more or less a shock because they were no longer considered the privileged. They were considered the other. And I found the young people, the adolescents and the adults, have gone through quite a a shock. It's almost like a what's the word I wanted? PTSD, like a PTSD. That they're everything is now I'm American. I'm American. And I think that that's something that we have to consider, because as Americans we don't often understand that, or we don't see that. But to be taken from a privileged state to one of being considered, wrong or terrorist, to be what you are, is something that I can only imagine is very difficult to deal with. So that may be something we want to look out for also.
I think one of the things is really important for us to realize when we think about the Muslim community, that we understand that the Muslim community consists of multiple sub-communities with multiple histories, with multiple different experiences. And when you work with an individual, you're able to bring that into it and not assume, oh, you're Muslim, you must be like this. Right. It's not a cookie cutter approach. And so what you were bringing up was an important factor to really realize what are those issues and ask those questions, because it's a different experience for different people. I mean, one of the research studies we're doing right now is looking at convert youth and how that experience is for young people. And so one of the issues that we're seeing is, I mean, I'm not going to say in findings because we're just looking at the data stuff. So, but one of the interesting questions we're asking is, for those who do convert, how is their experience with the greater society? So someone who may be of European American descent, they were initially part of the majority culture. And then by identifying with Islam, then they become part of the minority culture. So how is that transition different from someone from the African American community who had already been identified and who been struggled with history of oppression and institutional discrimination? How is that experience? And what community are they coming into? Is it an immigrant dominant community, or is it an indigenous community? And so these are all factors that come into play, and this is just multiple subset of one community amongst Muslim youth. So when we talk about Muslim youth, there are so many different subgroups that we need to consider when we work with them. So, and then in that part of that is, when you talk about community, what's your definition of community? Is it your ethnic, religious, is it your neighborhood community? Is it, what is their sense of, what do they define as community? And then a risk factor is the lack of community cohesiveness. If there isn't a team approach to parenting, it's going to be very hard. We do not live in a collectivist society where there is so many other individuals helping out with the child care, with the mentorship, with all different aspects of development, because it really, truly does take a village to raise a child. And when that isn't in place, you have lots of gaps where things can fall through the cracks.
I would have said that an excess of community cohesiveness is a risk factor.
An access?
An excess. I mean, it seems to me that there are many communities that are so insular that any behavior that deviates from that community's norm and moves towards assimilation is defined as being a problem. And that puts such a stress, I mean, you were talking about it a little before, that puts such a stress on the youth that they're at risk for all kinds of stuff.
I guess I was defining, I see what you're saying, and I would have to agree with you on that aspect. What I was thinking of with cohesiveness as kind of support mechanisms in place. If a parent can't do something, somebody else is there. Or if the child's not able to connect with a parent, they can connect with a mentor within the community. So those type of cohesiveness where there is that sense of, we want to raise all these young people together. But your point is also very important to consider. If there is cohesiveness to produce homogeneity, like have a homogeneous understanding and approach to Islam, because that's one of the issues that we're challenged with in the Muslim community. We love the concept of unity. And unity is important, but so is diversity. And our faith allows for that diversity of thought and approach. and for us to agree to disagree, but agree to work together. And so that concept, so when we sometimes, in our efforts for unity, we push down a kind of a one-size-fits-all Islam, when in reality that's not necessarily the case. And we know we have numerous different examples, legal examples from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, may peace be upon him, that says that, you know, different situations where he said there are multiple interpretations. You can use this variety. And so that's part of our discourse. Unfortunately, we tend to forget about that part and want to push one perspective or approach. But I think that's one of the things that we really need to help young people to understand, to realize that there is that diversity in thought, and to really understand what works within that particular context.
I agree with you in mentioning the various different factions of the Muslim community. One of my Muslim students identifies about 4 different races and nationalities that exist in her family. One is Native American, and another is Caucasian, and another is African American. And all of these are mixed of the blood in her family, not just community, but, and she's gone from very privileged in some situations to literally in poverty in other situations. She's lived back and forth from the West Coast to the mid-America and back and forth. And it's hard to keep up with her, but by the same token, you don't want to, you want to listen to every word that she says, because she's been all over the place without moving.
I think that's the richness that we need to really identify and understand, that each individual we work with or to come across us has a history, and to appreciate and understand where they're coming from. And until we ask those questions, you know, I spent a lot of time at the beginning to, you know, ask the questions. These are the different factors to consider, all that. Unless you ask those questions, you're never gonna know. You're gonna see that individual as probably whatever, like African American or whatever they look like, and then make assumptions based on that.
She looks Caucasian, but she's not. She doesn't see herself that way at all.
I don't mean to dominate, but I thought of, oh my goodness, sometimes I forgot. It had to do with what you were just saying about
intergenerational.
Intergenerational, that's what it was. One thing I think that is, again, somewhat unique in the Muslim community is when we go to talk to the parents of the adolescent, and then we talk to the adolescent, if the parent is an immigrant family, their values and culture and the way they look at things may be one way, and the child's, although they have been touched by that, they may choose at adolescence to start going in a different way. Now in America, kids do that anyway, okay? But the difference being that in America, it's still all the same culture. Whereas in the Muslim community, oftentimes it's a different culture. Sometimes with the children who convert, it's a different religion. So these are some things I think also to look for in the adolescent. You know, that they may be so far from, trying to be so far from where the parent is, in order to accept and to have Islam be a part of their lives and their experience, and so that we can't always align the parent's story with the child's story.
And then you also pointed on two points that I don't know if I mentioned clearly earlier, but also to consider, even if the parent is from this culture, say someone who converted to Islam and is indigenous, even if they grew up in this culture, they may not have grown up Muslim. And so what is that experience for their children, and how do they negotiate that whole discussion? That is another thing to consider. And another point that you kind of raised, at least in my mind, was the issue of, for a lot of the immigrant parents, some of the issues they would not even consider to be an issue, that they may not foresee it to be an issue. For example, I've had parents who will describe behaviors, and I could pick up that this child is probably doing some drugs. And they might blame it on something else. They're like, oh, they're just bad friends, or this. They may not realize that, your son, by the way, is a local drug dealer. And so that denial and that realization, not knowing what are the signs and symptoms of drug use, what may be going on. And so not being aware of those issues from the parental perspective is really important in terms of, we talked earlier about what can the community do to have those programs available. And one, first convince the parents that it is an issue within the community, and their child, no matter how religious your family is, can get involved. And as a parent, you'd want to know about that. So having those drug education programs within the communities, and it's actually really nice because in some communities you're hearing the Khatibs, the Friday prayer, the individuals doing the Friday prayer talk about these issues, so that the information is getting out slowly, and when it gets on the radar screen of the parents, then they're able to start seeing the need to have that additional education. So thank you for bringing those up.
I brought some brochures, and they're out on the table there. And one of SAMHSA's messages now is that recovery works, that you can recover. And I think that's, we were talking about the stigma of mental illness, but also with substance abuse and addiction, you can work through that, and you can live a good life, and a lot of times I think the popular culture anyhow kind of ends the conversation. If he's in trouble or a person's in trouble or is using substances in abusive ways, then that they think that's the end of the story. But there's many testimonials. There's a lot of evidence that we can, get beyond that. So I think that's another message there.
And I think it's really important for us to begin to embrace that.
Sometimes also when our children come to us with things they want to do, and we're Muslim, they're Muslim, we raise them, and maybe they want to do something that culturally we feel is wrong, although Islamically it may be okay. And we give the child the message, Muslims don't do that, okay? Then the child is forced to make a choice. Am I going to be Muslim or am I not? Do you see what I'm saying? So I think that as parents and as counselors, we have to always offer the opportunity that you can still be Muslim and do so-and-so because it's still accepted, or even if it's wrong, you can do it, but it's a sin or whatever. But you don't have to not be Muslim because you decide to smoke a cigarette. Do you understand what I'm saying?
So I think part of it has to do with education, like religious education. As a community, we don't have what some individuals are referring to as functional literacy about our religion. And because we don't have that functional literacy in terms of the basics of Islam and how you apply it in different situations, we have a very rigid approach to the practice of Islam. And because we're also not able to tell the difference between culture and religion, we pass on culture when it's actually, when we pass on religion, pass on culture when it's, you know what I'm saying. I'm getting confused. We pass on things that we say is religion when in fact in reality it's culture, which is very confusing for young people. And so again, everyone has a role to play depending on what role, where your sphere of influence is in your community or in your work environment. You'd want to go and help out in that perspective. And one of the things I often tend to do when it comes to substance abuse, because it's such a taboo subject within the Muslim community, is help realize that there were individuals who are highly esteemed in Islamic history who struggled with it. I mean, there is an example of a famous Sahabi who is a companion of the Prophet. And he was involved. He was involved in many important aspects of life, and he himself struggled with substance abuse. He was struggling with alcohol use. His name was Nuayman. Forget the last part of his name, but Nuayman something. I can get it for whoever's interested. I'm just forgetting at this moment. But I mean, when you start realizing the real issues that these issues we're having, it's not a result of Western culture and negativity. It's human reality that all cultures, all people face, and if we can help destigmatize it and help people realize you need to get the help and the message you said that recovery is possible. And so, but I think that adolescence period is really a wonderful period in the sense that a lot of these issues come up. And to help the community, help the parents, help the providers, realizing that resources are available, these are the different ways to address these issues, is extremely important. So moving along, because I see Farha and it scares me.
Oh, no, you are fine till 5.
Oh, I am fine till 5. Oh, good. Okay, good.
I've just heard such good things that I had to.
Oh, okay. Okay. So, going back to, where's that slide again? Here's that slide. We talked about these different aspects. Now I want to talk about here the society aspect and how does that impact the young person.
How can we get that slide?
This wonderful slide?
Yeah.
If you just type Google Learner 1998, you'll probably find it. It's the developmental contextual perspective.
She wants your email.
Oh, you want my email? Thank you for translating. If you leave your email here, if you leave your email here, I can send you the presentation, if you'd like. And actually, a lot of the risk information research, it's in the book, the Counseling Muslims book outside in the section on adolescents and emerging adults. So kind of look, it doesn't take this model because this model's, I haven't figured out how to explain it in words, but hopefully I'll do that. So going back to society, there are a lot of risk factors going on for the Muslim community that we need to understand and see how is that impacting young people. Islamophobia is the obvious one in terms of the current discourse, current fear. People are generally afraid of their safety in a physical attack. I don't know if anybody heard recently, just last Sunday at the Toledo Islamic Center, and that's actually where I grew up, that there was a kind of a bomb or explosive that was thrown in the prayer area. Wow. They caught the person. But to think that a few hours ago, my family was there, it scares an individual. And so this is increasingly happening over the last few years. And the increase in religious discrimination and the concerns and fears that people have. Is it safe for me to go out? How will people react to me? So young people, as we as adults can deal with this, it is difficult, but imagine a young person trying to figure out, well, how do I navigate this whole adolescence, and how, if I see myself as American, but for some reason my peers don't necessarily see myself as that way. So how do I deal with that? So that's kind of a risk factor to constantly be worried about your physical well-being. The either perceived or real religious discrimination that may be occurring, and how even if they may not individually be experiencing it, if they're constantly hearing about the reports of this individual or that individual, that constant fear and being on edge is already being internalized for young people. The political climate and discourse, the whole hoopla in the last election, what is Obama a secret Muslim? So what if he was? I mean, that political discourse going on is then automatically associating being Muslim with being, something that's not wanted in America. And again, young people hear it, they internalize it, it becomes part of their psyche, and they realize that, okay, maybe we're not wanted here. So then what happens there? And so society's view of Muslims, the Muslim young person's view of themselves, and how other people see them, and then that impacts their willingness to integrate. Well, if you're going to reject me, I'm going to reject you. I don't want to be part of society. And so that line of thinking starts to develop. And then, how do, the experience of Muslims in America is totally different than in France or England or Canada. And the societal discourse, the multiculturalism, the heterogeneity, what is valued, what is not valued. If you look even between Muslims in America and Muslims in Canada, totally different experience because of our culture. In in America we have more of a melting pot theory, whereas in Canada they have more of a salad bowl theory. And the salad bowl being, everyone is part of this country, everybody's part of Canada, but you still retain your individual identity, cultural identity. And so that has a different impact on government funding, the discussions that take place, the programs that are available, and you see that reflected amongst young Muslims in Canada compared to America.
Would you be open to looking at the media also as a bullet in the social risk factors,
Yes,
and how the media impacts all of those areas? One of the concerns that that I've had since being on active duty is that it really didn't matter so much what we think as a Muslim community or how we try to strategically deal with it. It's like this big ball of yarn that you're constantly trying to undo, that the media continues to just, continue to ravel. You undo it or untie a knot, and then there's another knot that comes right behind it and continue to roll. It just gains momentum. So I can imagine for like young people, the difficulty of them trying to navigate through media sources that continue to bombard all of us with all these negative images and the interpretation of Islam and its association with terrorism. And a person who is 13 or 14 years old that's in a school setting that has to deal with that on a day-to-day basis must be tremendous pressure on them. And then on top of that, if you have teachers that themselves don't try and undo some of that, and when I say undo, I'm talking about the misinformation that comes through the media. It just puts a lot of pressure on the adolescents, our adolescents that have to attend public schools.
And so part of it is the media frames the discussion of the societal discussions, frames the situations in a particular way. Yeah. And so we need to be aware of that so that we can help our children, our young people navigate and understand, they're saying this, but what about that? Getting them to engage in critical thinking. This is some of the things that you might want to do at the individual level, helping them to realize and deconstruct the media.
One of the things we do at home is that, my kids are now all a little older, but anything that's on television, especially the news, we have discussions about it openly. And I want to know what they think about it. I don't want them just to know my opinion. I want them to know, or I want to know what they think about what they're seeing, based upon how they understand their spiritual or religious background, and also how whatever it is they're seeing is impacting them. Because the reality is, even if they don't see things the way me and their mom sees it on every level, they still have to deal with it on an individual level when they go out there and they're dealing with their peers and they're dealing with other people when their mom and dad is not there. So we would have open discussions and then talk about, their thoughts and feelings about what's going on. And what I found now is that now that they're in their 20s, I'm very comfortable with, as a parent, their opinions and their ability to be able to handle a lot of those issues that are, some of which are very, very destructive. And I would just encourage parents to take that responsibility and not allow the kids to just absorb that stuff without getting any feedback from them whatsoever.
That highlights an important point of the parent-child relationship is extremely important. When we look at this, depending on our background, we can influence different areas. But for those of us who are parents, this parent-child relationship is extremely important. And if those of us who have an influence in the community, if you can help support this aspect, the child and the parent, teaching parents, it's important to have those discussions, have that connection, engage and play together, do different things, have that family cohesion going on to help support them through marriage education, parent education. Those are important protective factors. We've talked all day today about all the different risk factors, we haven't had time to talk about protective factors, but one of the things we really need to start thinking of, okay, these are the risk factors, these are the problems, these are the challenges that could potentially explode, could get into larger issues. Where can we get in and have the most impact?
Talking also about what he's saying, he's talking on a family basis. As a community, I would say that the African American Muslim community, because we are African American in this country, our cultural background is one of dealing with oppression. So when we become Muslims, that's still part of our culture. I say that to say that just as a family, a parent has to support his child, as communities, the African American community being of the culture that has already braced against racism and oppression, that our communities have to come together. African American community, the Pakistani community, the Syrian, we have to come together because we have knowledge of how to deal with this as Muslims in this country, and we can give that knowledge and we can share that knowledge, and just as you all have things with your cultures and so on that we need to share. And I find so often, I know Christians often say, they joke that on Sunday morning is the most segregated time, you know, of the country because everybody's in their own little things. Well, I'd say the same thing about us. Very often on Fridays you have the Pakistani mosque, you have this mosque, you have the black mosque, you know, and we're all every place and we're trying to solve the same problem, and each one is trying to reinvent the wheel. So I think we need to, as you were saying, as what's the wall that you were saying, to help that we have to build a wall for ourselves so that we can help our future, our adolescents, our children, because our grandchildren are not going to care what country their grandparents came from. They're really not going to care, even though that may hurt our feelings. But they don't care that their grandparent was Pakistani or this or that or the other. They're American, I'm American, and I'm Muslim. So how can I deal in this country? And we need to start looking ahead, I think, at that and dealing with it.
And I think part of it, a lot of it has to do with increased communication and understanding, because we sometimes assume we know when in fact we don't understand the other cultures and backgrounds. So a lot of, I'm sorry.
I wanted to just say something about your comment too. I think that conversation that you're talking about, I'd just be curious about, because it's a conversation that requires a lot of skill. And I'm thinking what can be done to support parents in how to have that conversation. It requires, we were talking about transference too, you know, in a way you bring your own kind of experiences and emotions to that media as a parent, and how do you deal with your own reactions? How do you then help your children developmentally take that in and have some positive steps that they can take in terms of their own repertoire of responses and behaviors to deal with what they encounter and be proactive.
Yeah, and that's actually, I'm the director of the Family Youth Institute. And so one of the major things, we have two aspects that we work on. One is doing the research that on Muslim families, how to strengthen and empower these families, but also providing education. So we send out regular emails to parents to help them understand how can you effectively communicate? How can you, how can you have those important discussions? What are the risk factors you need to consider? You know, all those things, we try to get the education out there. And so I think that's, again, like I said, each one of us has a sphere of influence. And to really figure out what is your sphere of influence. Maybe it's your family, your immediate family. Maybe it's a larger community. Maybe it's your work situation. Maybe it's the area policy. Whatever it is, understand what these risk factors are and help start providing alternatives or ways to help support families. And so what I want to talk a little bit, someone had asked about specific Muslim youth issues. Like I said earlier, we're just beginning in this field. And Cynthia, myself, and Wahiba back there, we've been doing some initial work on alcohol, tobacco, and water pipe use amongst Muslim youth. And our papers we've published a few, but one of the things that we find within the Muslim community, when we start sharing the stats of 46.6% of Muslim youth, college-age students have drank in the last month or year, right? And so part of that is that realization that this is an issue within the community we need to address, and it's a huge issue that we're in denial about.
Mega issue,
right? But for us to really start addressing, one, it is an issue, and then what are we going to do about it, and how are we going to work on that? And so what we're trying to do is try to get a better understanding, and there are other research teams across Europe and in Canada and other areas who are doing research on that as well. And so one of the things we realize, we do have an alcohol issue, we do have a tobacco issue that we need to address, and increasing use of water pipe, and there isn't as much social stigma associated with water pipe use.
Water pipe is tobacco.
I meant cigarette, sorry. So hookah use is what I was initially going to write, but it's under tobacco, it has to be inserted. The other issue of sexual risk-taking behaviors. One of the things we find is that those who are sexually active outside of marriage, Muslim youth, they are less likely to take precautionary measures for various different reasons. And so that's, again, these are issues we need to understand and address head on as a community, as parents, and to be aware that these issues exist, to have those conversations with our kids. Again, we're also seeing self-injurious behaviors, we see suicide, we are seeing criminal activity going on. Again, the thing I want to leave everyone with understanding is whatever is happening in society is also happening within the Muslim community. There is no, everything's, go ahead.
Oh, no, I mean.
So for us to realize we can't continue to live in denial and feel that, our religion will protect us. Yes, religious values and beliefs can serve as a protective factor, but it doesn't necessarily mean we won't deal with these issues.
Yeah, I mean, in talking about the sexual risk-taking behaviors, I think something that kind of gets under the radar, it's a huge elephant in the room, and under even the radar of substance abuse or addiction is pornography addiction, and it's huge. It's huge, and because it's cultural, with a lot of Muslim youth. And then, I mean, obviously, like around the world, and Muslim youth that are, internationally, but even right here, it's just seen, and the way people talk about it, it's just seen as entertainment. So that's kind of how, it kind of it gets minimized. And I'm talking an addiction, like dependency, like withdrawal symptoms, and can't do without it and stuff like that. It's really, and other things that come along with that. So, I mean, it's a lot of stuff, and and like you were, like your research suggests, it's approaching. It's like no difference of being Muslim and not Muslim. It's just you just kind of take on your environment.
Yeah, it's exactly like the issue of domestic violence. Mm-hmm. Domestic violence is 25% of Muslim women. They reported being abused by their husbands. Same percentage was reflected also in the American society. I think I just want to comments on your how you have discuss with your kids, but sometimes parents really are not aware how to discuss these things. In New York, we have run a training for 8 weeks, for 7 imams or 7 mosques there, and through the imams we had reached so many thousands of parents. Like when all these imams have come together and they addressed, for example, domestic violence, especially sexual abuse between a husband and wife. Before, they were really reluctant to really address these issues. It's exactly like, alcohol. It's exactly like, water pipes. So I think through our imams, every Friday, like thousands of people go to these mosques. This is the channel to start with. Mental health professionals, we need a lot of work and organizing efforts to really come together. Look at us now, I mean, to make this kind of conference come from New York, come from Washington, it's hard, but really to meet all these imams and disseminate this information and this training, through them we can reach as many as we can, just to educate our parents and through them to educate our children.
I'm so used to seeing these statistics in this country. I'm really not sure whether the same statistics with Muslims are really worse than, because we're expected here. It's been happening for so long. It's almost not only tolerated, but overlooked, you know. But because of, and it may be my naivete, but the standards are different from what I have gathered for at least some Muslims. And so if we're seeing equal statistics, is that really worse for the Muslim community?
Well, what we're seeing is, like I said, we're at the beginning stages of our research and understanding. Like our research team has done, have looked at the issue in 2 different ways, and then there's other studies have looked at it as well. So there is a difference in terms of prevalence rates that we're finding, but one of the challenges, because like I said, we're at the beginning stages, there's so many different factors that could be causing the differences that we're seeing. So we maybe see anywhere from 10% to 46%. There is this huge range. What are the reasonings and rationale for these things? It could be different things. It could be the sample size, where you're getting your sample from. It could be, some are more religious background, some are, not how are you defining Muslim? There's so many different factors we need to consider. So that's why.
And another issue, I think it was you who asked me this morning, can you trust somebody when they tell you whether they drank alcohol or they smoked marijuana?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if it's against your religion, are you as likely to say, oh yeah, I did it?
Sorry, I came in a little late. Wondering, did you define youth as under 21? Is that?
I didn't define it.
Okay, what age is it?
The reason I said adolescent and emerging adulthood, and that usually refers to like 12 to 25, 30. That's how I'm defining it right now. But yeah.
Are we so surprised because we expect our children not to do these things, and that we're surprised that they are doing it? Is because I hear in our voices, well, we're almost approaching what America has. We're in America. So I'm trying to understand why there's an expectation that Muslim youth would not reflect where they are. Do you know what I mean?
I think generally parents believe that being Muslim, because Islam prohibits alcohol, that they assume their kids will also not use alcohol.
Like to believe.
They would like to believe. Even though what we also find is parents are using as well.
Yeah.
So if parents are using, so I mean, so that's another thing to consider as well. The fact that we have these beliefs that, and another thing is a lot of people in the masajids, when we go to the masjid, they may say, well, I don't know any kids who drink. Well, that's also probably because they're not coming to the masjid.
Yeah.
So we see the same people, and because they don't have these issues, we assume this issue doesn't exist. So a lot of these issues many times community members will say, we don't have this issue or that issue or whatever issue amongst Muslims, when in reality it's there, but we may not be talking about it.
What I would say, and I've said this many times before, that we have to know the difference between Islam and Muslims. Okay? It is Islam that is not without error, not Muslims. Muslims have all kinds of faults and defects. And when you talk about Christianity or Christians or Jews and Judaism, it's basically the same thing from a theological perspective. And so I think as a deliverable, it becomes easier when you're educating to make that distinction right off the top, because then it becomes more clairvoyant for folks to be able to buy in.
Now, in light of that comment, who was the research done on? Muslims or Islamic?
So Muslims are followers of Islam.
Right.
Necessary.
Christians.
So in one study, we had asked individuals, were you raised in a Muslim, in a house, what household, can you remember the exact wording of the question? The household you were raised in, right?
Right. The family you were raised in.
The family
What
you were
was
raised in.
religious?
And you had the options of different religions. And and another study we'd done, it was Muslim students self-identifying themselves. So that's a big difference in terms of if you're raised in a Muslim household, but you may or may not agree. It may be a cultural identity. It may, you may not follow Islam anymore. Whereas in the other sample, we had gotten individuals through different organizations or places where they were referred by other Muslims.
But they were not all religious.
Yeah, they were not.
Right.
But they identified as Muslim.
And even to take that to its logical conclusion, and from what Imam Abdul Rashid said, and Islamic is not a big, difficult definition. It's very simple. Those who conduct their life by the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Quran and Sunnah. Real simple definition. And I guarantee if that's factored into the data, you will find a decreased prominence of those, for example, with children. The children that pray 5 times daily at this age, and you're not asking them or prompting them to do so, who fast Ramadan, who dress Islamically, modest dress, you will find a decreased occurrence of these behaviors. I know that you can
Actually-
save your money for the research on that.
Actually, we're not finding that, which is interesting.
And there's a problem in the scientific method.
Well, there are different reasons, and I think what we're finding is the external.
Can I jump in real quick, Sameera?
Can I just finish my statement and then you can jump in? What we're finding is how we define or measure religion, it differs in different religious backgrounds. And so one of the things, and this is kind of getting into technical details, but
Scientific methodology.
yeah. So the way we had looked at that study, we divided in terms of external and internal. So externally, in terms of the behaviors that people may engage in, we didn't necessarily see a difference.
There was no difference.
But the internal experience, the spiritual connection, that's where we started seeing a difference. Again, one study, but these are questions that we need to understand what's going on, because that might impact the religious socialization process. And so I just wanted to make that point.
So, for example, an internal one was, do your religious belief influence what you do? That was very strongly associated. Do you attend services? Do you go to religious services? Nothing. Yeah. Well, they don't answer that. If they don't agree with
It's
that,
the
that's one
design.
thing.
I don't think a non-Muslim, with all due respect to you, Dr. Cynthia, could even participate in an effective experimental design for what I was alluding to.
Well, we can talk about that
But
later.
if what you want to do is say, it's simple. The Muslim is the one who follows the Quran and Sunnah.
What do you mean when you say follow? Actually carries it out.
But in that case, don't we go from having 1 billion Muslims, now we're down to about 100,000 or something?
Globally?
So this is a really important discussion. I think
The good answer to that is we're more on the road going to Medina than going away, as the Ummah worldwide had been up until recent times.
So, this is an important discussion that's ongoing. And it's an important discussion that we need to continue to have, because that feedback that goes back and forth really helps us to understand what are the concerns and issues and valid concerns that we may have and can impact in the way forward. And so I think it's really important that we continue it, but I also want to keep track of time.
Here's a simple illustration. Do a survey of those children who attended madrasa and then actually continue to carry out. Okay, why not?
So let me.
They're not going to.
Let me continue.
The public school. They're not going to
And
use alcohol and have sex outside of marriage at the same rate.
Great points. Let's discuss it later on. I still need to finish my program. Okay.
He wants
So,
to say something.
so in terms of the research, so we're again at the very preliminary stages, and so we're still looking into these issues. And so as we present, again, please give us feedback so that we can improve and get better understandings. But again, the big reason why we want to understand all this is to understand the implications. We all have different spheres of influence. We all can have an impact on individuals, families, communities. So we want to be able to identify what are those potential risk factors. And based on those risk factors, based on the knowledge and understanding that we have, we need to then help through either counseling applications that we may be trained in, or through community prevention and support services. And so one of the suggestions that, I was planning on doing, but Sister Zakia had asked us to do anyways, was to really start thinking, we have this information, we have this knowledge, what are we going to do about it? So I'm going to give you a case study, probably only be able to do one, to identify possible developmental risk factors, identify contextual risk factors, and if you're in the counseling domain, counseling considerations, and if you're in the community domain, what are the preventative programs that you would suggest? Okay. So again, those are those individuals who are in mental health. If you're a mental health worker or clinician, please come over here. Those of you who are community activists, I'm going to ask you to come here. And those of you who are in the pastoral care area in the back table.
How about researchers?
Researchers come here. Researchers come here.
We're miscellaneous at this
Miscellaneous. So here's
miscellaneous. We're up here.
Here's my case, and if we can do more than one, that would be great. Okay. So if you can move miscellaneous group here, community activists here, pastoral care and clinicians. Okay? So the first case, Lauren is a 22-year-old European American convert revert woman living in rural Midwest community. She is referred to you because she is increasingly withdrawn, appears lonely, and is having difficulty integrating with her peers. Okay? So again, what I'd like you to do, I'll bring it up again. Identify possible developmental risk factors, contextual risk factors, and then for you guys, counseling considerations, miscellaneous research, community activists, what are the things that you could do within the community to help support?
At university.
Okay? What are the community prevention and programming suggestions? Does everybody have that? Okay, I'm going to go back to the case. Okay. Lauren is a 22-year-old European American convert revert woman living in a rural Midwest community. She is referred to you because she is increasingly withdrawn, appears lonely, and is having difficulty integrating with her peers. So community people, what can you do as a community to help support her?
I would go back to the other.
Researchers or miscellaneous? What can you do? Clinicians, what can you do from a counseling perspective?
5 minutes?
Yeah, you only have 5 minutes. You should do this now. Okay, what I'd like to do is kind of end. If you guys don't mind, if I can get everyone's attention again. I was hoping we'd go through the case, but I hope.
One group and we'll do a little debriefing after you're done.
Okay. So I had wanted to do kind of a discussion, but.
Yeah, go ahead. All yours. I'm just bringing you more audience.
Oh, okay. Just kind of conclusion points. First thing is realizing the importance of the developmental context that the individual you're dealing with, and being aware of that. Ask the questions. Be very careful of the assumptions you may have before you start helping the individual, because oftentimes if we don't ask the right questions, if we if we have certain assumptions about an individual, we can do more harm than help. So understand the developmental context, identify potential risk factors, and really the importance of early identification, counseling, and prevention. Really, wherever your sphere of influence is, work in that direction. And I think that if we slowly start understanding that, we can help young Muslim youth deal with issues that they are dealing with. If you have any questions, I know we ran out of time, but if you want a copy of the presentation, just come up here and then leave your email, and I can email that out to you. And then if you have further questions, you can email me at my email, director@FYI. And thank you very much, everyone, for being here the whole day.